Howdy! Welcome to the Whiskey Butler. I'm your host, Wesley Butler, here to serve you a little holiday whiskey wisdom. Day 11 of this journey that we're on, otherwise known as Christmas Eve, December 24th, or the seventh night of Hannakuh for my friends out there who may be celebrating that holiday as well. We have some potato latkes here. We've seen a lot of whiskeys. We've had a lot of good whiskeys so far. Today will be no different. Not even gonna mess around and for the intro, everything. Today's whiskey is gonna be one of the best bottled and bond whiskeys out there. So, what we have is E.H. Taylor, but there are several E.H. Taylor variations, right? We're going to have two of the three sort of what they call the normal E.H. Taylor variations. So we have the E.H. Taylor small batch, bottled and bond, and all of these three normal variations are going to be bottled and bond. And then we have the E.H. Taylor single barrel, and we also, what we don't have here is the E.H. Taylor rye. Don't have that currently in my collection. Always looking for it to get my hands on it, but Colonel E.H. Taylor really was one of the pioneers and helped getting the Bottled and Bond Act passed. So his three normal variations are all bottled and bond, which is one of the reasons why I like them. And so that's what we're going to drink today. So I'm going to go ahead and pour myself a glass here as we sit and talk about it. But I think today we're going to talk more about the man behind the whiskey versus the whiskey itself. And why do you say that? I'm pouring the single barrel because it's the holidays. Feel a little special. Gonna go with the single barrel. So why are we gonna talk more about the man than the whiskey today? Because talking about the whiskey is gonna be simple. It's freaking fantastic, okay? E.H. Taylor was one of the first bourbon whiskeys that I ever had. And it's one of those, once you've had it, you just compare everything else to it. Doesn't have an age statement on it. It's bottled and bond, so it's at least 4 years. My guess is that it's probably in the 6 to 8 year range, but I don't know that for sure. The mash bill is the Buffalo Trace Mash number 1, which means it has a lot of corn in it, some malted barley, some rye, very low percentage of rye, but that's the Buffalo Mash number 1, and it's 100 proof. Why? Because it's bottled and bond, so we know it's got to be 100 proof. And let me just see. Yep, still fantastic. So that's what we're going to do today. But you're probably asking yourself, well, why are you going to talk about the man behind the whiskey? Well, as I said before, it's Christmas Eve, 7th night of Hanukkah. These are nights that are usually reserved for family gatherings. Maybe you open a present or two, you have some dinner, you sit around the fire, you tell stories about the year or about years before. Maybe people even come and tell the same stories that they told the previous year that you were like, oh, I've had these before. So I figured, why not tell a story here on this Day 11 episode about Colonel E.H. Taylor? We can learn some more about him. So with that, I would like for you to grab a beverage. We got some hot apple cider here. You can't really see the smoke, but got some apple cider here, not spiked. We got some potato latkes here. We got some whiskey, so grab a bite, grab a drink, sit back, and I got a little story for you, Ags. Whoop! My people out there know what we're talking about. All right, so I think I've said in these episodes many a times that bourbon history is really a lot of lore and a lot of myth. And the reason for that is because not a lot of it was written down, right? That's actually not the case with Colonel E.H. Taylor here. A lot of the things about E.H. Taylor have been written down. He has, by some, call him the father of the modern bourbon industry here in the United States. Or you could say father of the modern whiskey industry here in the United States. But we're going to say bourbon industry because that's what he made a lot of. So we're going to talk a little bit about it, why they call him that. And, E.H. Taylor ran in some very influential circles. It's hard to really talk about him without sounding like you're name dropping. So we're going to drop a few names. you'll probably hear some names and they go, wait a minute, I've heard that name before. How is that associated with E.H. Taylor? Yeah, there's a lot of that goes on. We're not going to go into all of that in this episode, but there's certainly going to be a few nuggets of knowledge that we're going to drop on you today. So what we're going to start with, hold on, let me grab a bite here. That was a big bite. I left the sour cream upstairs. What we're going to start with is Colonel E.H. Taylor Jr. Now, Edmund Hayes Taylor Jr. did not serve in the military and was not in the Army, did not actually earn the rank of colonel. He's a Kentucky colonel, kind of like the guy that makes the fried chicken, right? Colonel Sanders. It is a nickname that is bestowed upon an individual by the governor and the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and that is where the colonel on E.H. Taylor Jr. comes from. So, just to go ahead and clarify that, that's how we start. But our story of E.H. Taylor begins, Edmund Haynes Taylor begins in 1830 in Columbus, Kentucky, where he was born. The colonel and I actually share some personal history or some personal facts about our history that are very similar, in that E.H. Taylor's dad died when he was 5, like my dad died when I was 5. And after that happened, he was sent to live with a distant relative on a plantation in New Orleans, Louisiana. That distant relative that he was sent to live with was Zachary Taylor. Old Rough and Ready, they used to call him. And if you're wondering, Zachary Taylor, why does that name sound familiar? That is because Zachary Taylor went on to become our 12th president of these United States. So his great uncle, Zachary Taylor, went on to become president. That's who he grew up with in Louisiana. Went to, I want to say, a Tulane preparatory school or something like that. He ended up moving back to Kentucky in 1851 to live with his uncle, Edmund Haynes Taylor, which is where the junior comes from, because Edmund Haynes Taylor was his dad's brother, so they had to call him Junior so everyone would know the difference in who they were referring to. So E.H. Taylor Jr. moves back to Kentucky, gets the junior name because he's living with Edmund Haynes Taylor, his uncle, his dad's brother. So that's where the junior comes from. E.H. Taylor Sr. was a banker in town, very prominent banker, and that is the profession that E.H. Taylor Jr. picked up upon arriving back in 1851. So within a year of moving back, he meets a young woman named Fanny Johnson, gets married. He and Fanny go on to have 7 children. I want to say it's 4 boys, 3 girls, but they end up having 7 children over the course of their marriage in his lifetime. So, all right, let's get back to the whiskey part of this story. So E.H. Taylor Jr., he's now in Kentucky. He's working as a banker, and this is where his interest in the whiskey business really starts to come from. Because as a banker, he has access to the books and records of all the distillers and salesmen in town, right? So he can tell what's going on. From time to time, he secures finances for equipment and goods and so on and so forth. And this is really where he starts to get the idea of, man, you know what? I could be in the whiskey business, but if I'm going to be in the whiskey business, I want to do it right. I want to do it better than anyone has ever done it before. And this leads him to start a company with a couple of business partners. I want to say it's called W.A. Gaines and Company. They start that there in Kentucky. But soon after starting that company, E.H. Taylor takes a trip to Europe. Why does he take a trip to Europe? Well, he takes a trip to Europe because he wants to learn firsthand about the distilling process from the folks over there who make whiskey. So hopefully all of you out there know that they started making whiskey in Ireland and they started making whiskey in Scotland long before these United States were even colonies, okay? So he goes over there to learn about the process. What do they do? How do they make their whiskey there? He even goes to Germany to learn about how they distill beer in Germany, just so he can really, really get the finer details of the process down to bring that back over here to the U.S. to start making his whiskey. So what is the main concept that he learns on this trip? Main concept that he learns is that using copper in the fermenting and distilling process really helps your end product. Okay, so it always helps to start with good ingredients, right? But the fermenting and distilling process and using copper is certainly the main thing that he brought back. So he comes back. He's got this company called W.A. Gaines. Before they open their first distillery, before he and his business partners open their first distillery in 1867, he purchases a brand called Old Crow from the Oscar Pepper Distillery. Okay, Old Crow was a brand made famous by Dr. James Crow, aka Dr. Jim Crow, refining the process after about 2 decades. So they buy this mostly for the sour mash recipe and the sour mash process that Dr. Crow had mastered, right? So we buy the Old Crow brand to get the sour mash recipe and the process. We come back from Europe with our distilling knowledge of copper, fermenting, column still, so on and so forth. So they open their first, I say they, E.H. Taylor and his business partners, they open their first distillery in, I want to say it was in Frankfurt, and they move on after that to buy a distillery, the Leestown Distillery, and they rename that the Old Fire Copper Distillery, aka OFC Distillery, which they still use that term to this day. That is the distillery that he really went to work on rebuilding, reshaping, state of the art equipment, column stills, everything to really refine this process. So that is how we get to about 1869. Okay, so they're doing well in the business. They're selling lots of whiskey, but even though Colonel E.H. Taylor's profession was a banker before he got into the whiskey business, everyone makes mistakes, and he may have overextended himself using too much credit to build out his process, making his whiskey and everything. And so in order to pay off those debts, he had to sell his distillery and ended up selling the distillery to a business out of St. Louis led by a man named George Stagg. George Stagg, yes. Now, the Colonel and George Stagg, let's just say the friction was real, okay? There was so much friction, it's really not, we really don't have time in this episode, or I really don't want to take the time in this episode to get into all the friction that went on between them. But the two did eventually part ways, with Colonel Taylor ending up selling all of the rights and everything to his distilleries over to George Stagg and his business partners, and they parted ways in 1885. If you would like to read more, there were lawsuits, several lawsuits back and forth between the two. If you would like to actually learn more about the friction between those two and the lawsuits specifically, I recommend this book called Bourbon Justice here. It is a very good read. It goes into a lot of detail over the lawsuits, several bourbon lawsuits or whiskey lawsuits in history, but specifically it's got some details in there about the lawsuits between Colonel Taylor and George C. Stagg, or George Stagg, and their frictional relationship. So, good book if you ever decide to check it out. So, there's definitely a lot more to Colonel E.H. Taylor that we could talk about. He's got several connections to distilleries that you know today or may have heard of in the past, like Woodford, Castle and Key, Old Pepper, Jim Beam. The stories go on and on about the distilleries that he owned, that he helped create, the brands that he helped create, the recipes and mash bills that he helped create. But there's just a lot to go into. Just wanted to give you a tidbit about the history of Colonel E.H. Taylor. But before we finish, I do want to get back to the fact that he did serve 16 consecutive years as the mayor of Frankfurt. And during this time is when he used his, we'll say, collective influence over lawmakers here in Washington, D.C. to end up getting the Bottle and Bond Act passed in 1897, which to some is considered the first consumer protection law. That ended up being the last professional accomplishment for Colonel E.H. Taylor. He ultimately passed away in 1923 at the age of 92, but he is a legend in the bourbon and whiskey community, and that lives on today in these whiskeys through the Buffalo Trace Distillery owned by Sazerac. So I want to give a toast to Colonel E.H. Taylor Jr. for all that he has done for bourbon whiskey. I mean, what he did was great, but I'm telling you, if you read this book, I mean, he was a shrewd businessman, let me tell you. But we give a toast to Colonel E.H. Taylor and all that he did. I also give a toast to you and your family on these holidays, Christmas Eve, 7th night of Hanukkah, or whatever it is that you might be celebrating. I hope everyone has a safe and joyous holiday season. Thank you for watching this episode. Thank you for watching previous episodes. I thank you in advance for watching future episodes like the one coming tomorrow on day 12 when we talk about our last Bottle and Bond whiskey. So please like, share, comment on this episode. Please subscribe if you're not a subscriber. And don't forget to click the bell when you subscribe so you're always reminded of new episodes. And I would like to thank you for watching, and to all, a good night.